Well, good afternoon, and welcome to part four of our six-part series looking at the United States Constitution, past, as well as then looking at it from the perspective of into the present and projecting onwards as well, as we'll do in our final day together in a couple of weeks, projecting onwards as well into the future. Well, we spent a good deal of time talking in terms of the impact that both the island nation of Britain had here on the United States, this new nation formally coming into being July 4th, 1776, but also here the nation of France and the French Enlightenment. Here, this hostility towards monarchies, or if there was in essence here a monarch, a king or queen who was abusing his or her power. Here it was, in the words of Rousseau and his social contract, the right of the citizenry to rise up in rebellion and get rid, in essence, of this unjust monarch. Well, this, for the American founding fathers, proved to have enormous significance because they argued that George III was, in fact, here abusing his rights, abusing the colonies, etc., and that the only option, the only solution here was formal independence. Which effectively is declared, really with the Continental Congress, as we saw in 1775. It's official with the Declaration of Independence, crystal clear, July 4th, 1776. Well, the Americans here are going to emerge victorious. They'll emerge victorious. The British, as I've referenced before, knew. They knew that they were going to lose the American colonies. It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. They were hoping to hold on to them into the early 1800s, but unfortunately that did not materialize, especially following the British defeat at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. So the independence here of this nation is effectively granted in 1783 in the Treaty of Paris. But for the 13 colonies, the issue, as we saw in terms of earlier presentations, was now what? And what you have here is this need for a strong central government. But the states are very, very suspicious of each other, almost as suspicious as they were of the British. They're independent, but by the same end, they need the strong central government. But the concern, particularly on 10 of the 13 smaller states, is that the abuse of the large, big states, namely here, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Virginia, the nation is going to rest on those 3 states exclusively, and the other 10 are going to be swept to the curb. Well, the Constitutional Convention here is going to nevertheless be established in 1787. And the goal here is to create, in essence, a strong federal government. A strong federal government. And in this regard, over the course of these delegates here discussing through the summer, starting in May onwards into September of 1787, you start off the convention with 55 delegates. Every single state is represented of the 13 states with the exception of Rhode Island. There were prominent people like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, who were not even in the country at this time. They were off in Europe. You have people, though, like George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, who, in fact, will all be present here in Philadelphia in 1787. And the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective is to establish a strong federal government. And the model that will be used here is to have 3 distinct branches. 3 distinct branches, a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And in this regard, each one in a system of checks and balances, none of them should be able to become more superior to the other 2. So you're looking here, in essence, for somewhat of a harmonious relationship, if this in fact would be at all possible. The legislative branch, as we know, is going to, in essence, be the easiest of the 3, because here with the legislative branch, you're going to have this lower house, a House of Representatives, and you have these representatives from these different states. How big and how many representatives you're going to have is based on your population. Well, this is going to clearly follow here favor those big 3 states. But you're going to have here in the House of Representatives, it'll be based on population, it's the lower house. Then you have the upper house, the Senate, as it will be referred to as. And each and every one of the 13 states is going to be granted here or will have 2 senators. So in that regard, there's a sense here of equality, and it's also more important, far more important than the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, which remains up to and including the present day, far more prestigious. And at least initially here, senators are going to be appointed by the state legislatures. Eventually, they will be popularly elected just like members of the House of Representatives. So the legislative branch, which mimics, quite frankly, the British House of Parliament with the House of Commons and the House of Lords to a very, very great extent. This legislative branch is the easiest. It's the easiest of the three to, in fact, formally follow, to represent, to get this up and off the ground, to get common agreement, at least from those delegates here in Philadelphia. Well, as 1787 progressed, we have the introduction as well of the executive branch. And the executive branch proved, in essence, it proved to be much more of a challenge. And much more of a challenge because the concern is that you'll have an individual overseeing the executive branch, a chief executive, who could easily here take on too much power. It could be something resembling that of a power grab. And in essence, you don't want anybody or in any way, shape, or form who's going to resemble a king. We just got rid of George III. It's the last thing we want here is a chief executive who's going to resemble a king. Simply cannot happen. It cannot happen. So in this sense, there was grave concern regarding the power of this individual and keeping it limited. Keeping it limited. What's oftentimes used here is in the 1600s in the island nation of Britain. On the island nation of Britain, you had in essence this English Civil War and the British monarchy, or the English monarchy here. The ruling king at that time was Charles I. And Charles I is going to be overthrown. He gets into a disagreement here with the House of Parliament. And what happens is you end up with this civil war, and the forces of Parliament under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell eventually are going to emerge here victorious in this civil war in 1649. And the king, Charles I, is going to be accused of high crimes and misdemeanors, and he is going to be effectively here executed on January 30th, 1649. Well, Oliver Cromwell, who does not have royal blood, he's not in any way, shape, or form even an aristocrat, he's a member of Parliament, sets up here what's called a Lord Protectorate. He can't call himself king because he doesn't fit the bill in any way, shape, or form. But he emerged victorious here on the side of the English Civil War, and Cromwell is going to become even more powerful than King Charles I, who was effectively deposed, had ever been, or for that matter, his predecessors. So when he dies in 1658, as far as British Parliament is concerned, never again are we going to have any individual who is going to abuse their power to the stage that Oliver Cromwell did. This is something that the Founding Fathers are very concerned about, very concerned in terms of this executive branch. By the same end, they are also worried in terms of the popular election of this person. The popular election, because the delegates here in Philadelphia are very well-to-do landowners. They're all members of the upper class here in colonial America, and they have a bit of a patronizing attitude, quite frankly, for the lower classes. You could vote in the United States at this time. You could vote if you were male and you owned property. Even just a little bit of property, it didn't matter. But you have a bit of a pecking order in that regard. So the Founding Fathers here are also worried about this executive branch. If it's popularly elected, the majority of these people are flocking to the polls. They probably can't make the right choice. So what they do is they're going to have popular elections, but they'll also instill here the insurance policy, the Electoral College. So in presidential elections, you're not really voting for a president. What you're voting for is you're voting for delegates from a respective party to, in fact, put that person in the office of the presidency. It was an insurance policy because the delegates here had little confidence in your average citizen making the right choice. Well, the judicial branch here, you're going to be introducing federal courts. You're also going to have a Supreme Tribunal or a Supreme Court. The concern here with the Supreme Court is that if you get into a case that the Supreme Court puts forth a proclamation and the other branches ignore it, well, you've got a constitutional crisis. So you are going to also be here as Supreme Court Justice for life. Supreme Court Justice for life, if you so choose. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But you'll be appointed here for life, and by the same end, in this case, you will have a tremendous amount of power issuing in terms of judgments or proclamations. You are going to be interpreting the Constitution, etc. But ultimately, here, there's nothing that says how many Supreme Court justices there can be. We know how many members of the House of Representatives, piece of cake based on population. Start off with 65 total in the House of Representatives in the United States. We know how many senators. Well, we got 13 states. You got 2 senators each, 26 senators. We're going to have 1 chief executive and cabinet members as well, more people to as well fill out the executive branch. How that would all turn out, they weren't entirely sure. There would be a work in progress. With the judicial branch, you could have 7 Supreme Court justices, you could have 50, you could have 24, you could have 4, it didn't matter. That was something that could be, in fact, here a flexible number. And it remains as such here in the present day, though by and large you usually had 9, but there have been other numbers here over the course of the 1800s. So in this sense, you have here these 3 branches formally set up, and they're supposed to be, and they're going to be, flexible. A lot of the wording here by the father of the Constitution, James Madison, had to, in fact, here be flexible. Well, as we already know, on September 17th, 1787, you have here still about 41 delegates who are in Pennsylvania. They are in here Philadelphia, who are going to, in essence, 38 of them, will formally sign this Constitution. And the issue here is there's also going to be large protests coming from one of the large major states, Massachusetts, that they want added here a Bill of Rights. James Madison doesn't want to add a Bill of Rights. He doesn't want to add a Bill of Rights. As far as he's concerned, it's overkill. We want a flexible document. That is something here that could be changed as time, in fact, formally progresses. But what he also realizes here, James Madison, that unless he puts together these 10 Bill of Rights that's acceptable from a standpoint here of actual ratification, yes, you can get the initial document ratified, but that you have to follow through with Part 2, these 10 constitutional amendments. It's going to be very, very difficult here to get this up and off the ground. He is opposed to it. He is opposed to it entirely. He thinks the Constitution is fine the way it is, and perhaps he's probably right. But politically, he has no choice. He has no choice. The ratification process here begins without the Bill of Rights. It begins here formally without the Bill of Rights. And what happens is we end up in a situation here that the first state to effectively ratify, because it all goes to the state legislatures, would be Delaware, December 7th, 1787. Here, and in this regard, you need the majority, 2/3 majority. Pennsylvania will follow, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. Massachusetts is holding out for the time being until it is actually promised here that a Bill of Rights will follow. So they agree then to formally ratify this document, this Constitution, February of 1788. Maryland, South Carolina would follow suit. And on June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire would make it official, being here the last needed state to effectively ratify the Constitution. The federal government, therefore, in the United States formally convenes on March 4th, 1789. While the other states would still here follow suit, Virginia would ratify the Constitution June of 1789. State of New York would follow in July, North Carolina in November, and finally the last holdout of the original document would be Rhode Island of May 29th, 1790. Well, the Bill of Rights here is now also put forth, so you're looking immediately towards changes, 10 add-ons, 10 amendments. Here, kind of like a big postscript, so to speak, added to the U.S. Constitution. And in this sense, if you look at the Bill of Rights, I mean, some aspects of it, not so much, but most of it comes literally out of the Magna Carta, coming from historic Britain, or England, better known to as the time. King John here of England was abusing his power. He wasn't taking any orders from Parliament here in 1215. As far as he was concerned, Parliament was beneath him. So what happens not too far from London in this meadow known as Runnymede, members here of the House of Parliament are going to pursue him, and they are going to force King John here to sign, in essence, the Magna Carta. And what the Magna Carta of 1215 stresses back in British history is that the king is not above the law. No one is above the law. No one is above the law. And this was something for the Founding Fathers that they would have agreed with 100%. 100%. So you have, in terms of the Bill of Rights, it draws heavily from the British Magna Carta of 1215. You have not just that no individual is above the law, laws pertain to everyone. You also have in trial of jury. Okay, you're entitled to a trial of jury here. That's right out of the Magna Carta. Ties in with the Bill of Rights. That here, in terms of trials themselves, should not be unnecessarily delayed. And in this case, James Madison is following through with what he has to effectively to keep everybody all together, to keep them locked on, or at least as best as possible as time, in fact, formally moves onward. Well, you can have amendments added to the Constitution, as I referenced. And the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, that's what you got. But as I referenced here as well, 1791, it becomes official. But what I referenced here as well is the fact that constitutional amendments happen all the time, over the course of the years that follow. And there have been a total of 11,770 amendments proposed to the U.S. Constitution to date. 11,770 and counting. It is very, very difficult. Of those 11,770 amendments proposal to the Constitution, only 17 have actually been added. 17. We're going to look at those over the remainder of our time together in our series. Not each and every one of them, but some of the biggies. So just 17 of the 11,770 proposals actually become amendments here added to the Constitution, which is good, which is a good thing too, and something that Madison would embrace, because in this regard, he wants this Constitution to be a living, breathing document, a flexible document, and by the same end, if people want to make changes, then there's enough here, because he recognizes that 100 years from now, the United States as a nation might look very, very different, most likely would look very different than it would in the 1790s. If that is the case, it would not prove to be all that challenging to effectively pull this off. Well, the nation now would move forward. It would move forward here after the constitutional amendments are added, the Bill of Rights, and George Washington is going to become the first president of the United States. Washington was this charismatic figure, monumental figure, an individual who would give very, very few speeches, as we know, on the floor here of the Constitutional Convention. He also wanted to be very, very careful, because in the 1790s you have this two-party system emerging. The first party here would be the Federalists, and the Federalist Party would in fact be strongly represented by Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton, who we've introduced here in earlier presentations, wanted this strong federal government. Wanted here one central currency, basically the overseer, ultimately the heart and soul of this nation is this strong federal government. It had to be. It had to be that way, the Federalist Party. By the same end, you have Thomas Jefferson, who at the time of the Constitutional Convention was the American minister to France. Thomas Jefferson, though agreeing with having a strong federal government, also wanted to be sure that the rights of individual states were not abused. Because you've got here the vast majority, 10 of these 13 states are fairly small, not his home state of Virginia, but a good many of them are small, and by the same end, you don't want the larger states, even though in theory they shouldn't be able to, dictating to these smaller states. Well, it wouldn't be just here Thomas Jefferson, it would also be James Madison, who would belong to what was known as the Democratic Republican Party. So you have these two political parties, Federalist Party, strong federal rule, Alexander Hamilton. The Democratic Republicans, you have by the same end here people like Thomas Jefferson. They support a strong government, but you also want to be very, very careful in terms of the rights of individual states. James Madison would agree with that entirely. Well, what George Washington would do is he's going to be elected president to a 4-year term, as described in the Constitution. And you have to run for the presidency every 4 years. You're going to have an election. Even if you won the first go-around, you decide to run for a second term, well, you've got to run for a second term. You have to be effectively elected for this position. But Washington's not going to run as a Federalist or a Democratic Republican. He's somebody who's above it all, in essence. And it's difficult to say which political party he actually belonged to. He seemed to lean more towards Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. Washington, in his decisions here, was more of a Federalist than a Democratic Republican. But by the same end, he was careful to walk, in essence, down the middle of the road. After here being reelected to a second four-year term in office, he decided here enough was enough. It was a good experience, very positive, no doubt whatsoever as far as Washington was concerned, but it was time to step aside and let somebody else here oversee the reins of the nation, so to speak. And John Adams then would become elected as the second president in U.S. history, John Adams. Well, in this situation, from the standpoint of the United States as a nation, by the time we get to 1800, here, the nation itself is still very, very small. It's a growing nation. You have a population of 5 million citizens here along the eastern seaboard of the United States. 5 million, but in terms of overall power, it's incredibly weak, tremendously weak. And in this sense here, trying to pull itself together, its number one trade relationship here at the dawn of the 19th century would be with Europe. But the problem as well is that not only were the British taking advantage of the Americans, so too were the French. The French would, along with the British, they would come up on American merchant ships. They would board the ships. They would basically here seize all the cargo. They would take here these American merchant sailors and they would force them either into the French Navy or the British Navy, depending on the situation. And quite frankly, there was little to nothing that the Americans could, in fact, formally do. So it became very, very difficult because the states here, if they weren't heavily involved in European trade in the early 19th century, they were utterly opposed to approving or supporting in any way, shape, or form what this new nation needed desperately, and that was a navy. It was a navy. The United States Navy would not come into existence here until the third presidency here, or the third president came to office, and that was Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson had a very difficult time convincing here all these states to have a navy. Well, if we don't want our merchant sailors kidnapped and all our cargo seized, etc., we've got to find some way of protecting our nation, our well-being. By the same end, you have the origins as well, when we get into the early 1800s, the origins as well of a bit of a rift. Now, countless new individuals are going to be arriving in the United States, seeking citizenship in this new nation, and where they're coming from overwhelmingly is they're coming from the British Isles. They're coming from England, from Wales, they're coming from Scotland, they're coming from Ireland as well to an extent, but if they're coming from Ireland, they're overwhelmingly here Protestant in terms of orientation, in terms of religious identification. This nation, the United States, going back to the colonial era, was a nation for white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, plain and simple. That was going to be the defining element across the board. But more and more individuals here from the British Isles and from other parts of Western Europe will start arriving here in the United States as the early 1800s, here, in fact, formally continues. And with this happening, where the vast majority of them are settling, the Constitution here is the law of the land. What you have, in essence, is the vast majority of them are settling in the Northeast. They're settling in the Northeast, quite frankly, due to the fact that there's more opportunities. If you're an immigrant here arriving in this immigrant nation, you're making up here, especially when you see a larger and larger influx, what's known as the old immigrant class, coming to this nation from 1820 to 1840. Well, in this case, there's much more opportunities here in the historic northern colonies, especially here in the northeastern part of the United States, than there would be settling in any of the other states. In the other states, it was more of a sense of landed wealth, etc. The job opportunities are simply not there. It's becoming more and more of two distinct entities regarding here lifestyles, regarding the southern states who are seeing things from more of a traditional perspective. They have here this institution of slavery. The northern states initially also here, countless northerners were slave owners, but it was something here that they weren't involved in agricultural production. They're more interested in business and manufacturing and commerce. So it was something that was beyond the pale. It was no longer here any level of interest whatsoever. But as I had described before at the Constitutional Convention, the elephant in the room is this institution of slavery. And the issue here for the Founding Fathers, these very well-to-do delegates, the majority of whom are in fact slave owners, they're not touching that, not in any way, shape, or form. Certainly not. And you have here this movement to rid the nation of slavery, seeing this as what it was, incredible injustice, a horrific situation in the vast majority of cases, and something here that as the 1800s progressed needed to be effectively abolished. Well, you have this Protestant religious group, the Quakers, and the Quakers here, the Society of Friends, are front and center in terms of getting rid of this institution of slavery, abolishing it once and for all. But the problem here fundamentally is this is going to have to be done in a step-by-step process. I reference the fact that around the time of 1776, only 6%, 5% of Americans owned slaves, and they were overwhelmingly located in the South. Well, that's true, but the way it was actually counted would be more of a sense by families. And if you break it down by families, and especially break it down across the southern states, you have 30% of southern families owned at least one slave. Now, some of the larger here plantations had literally hundreds, some cases thousands of slaves. But what the Quakers were after, along with other groups here in the early 1800s, was to abolish first and foremost the slave trade. They're not going to be able to abolish slavery. They see it as incredible injustice and moral evil, but by the same end, they want to here, first things first, get rid of end this slave trade that had been going on since the 1600s back in American society, back at the time of colonial times, and now onwards into the United States as a nation. It's continuing. Well, in 1808, the slave trade would in fact be formally abolished. It would be formally abolished, and the Quakers have, along with these other groups, they have here a very significant victory. But it's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, and what I mean by that specifically is that although you've abolished slavery, you've abolished the slave trade, I should say. In this sense, the slave population, which makes up about 20% of the U.S. population, I should say, 20% of the U.S. population at this time. By the time we get to 1840, it'll make up about 15% of the overall U.S. population. It's a sizable number, a declining number, but by the same end, here you have a population that is still very significant. And as time, in fact, moves on, for the United States, you have this movement of what is described as manifest destiny. Certainly not all here Americans, whether they were old immigrants or they traced their ancestry to colonial America. What you have here is this movement on the part of this new nation, the United States, to eventually here expand, not just from the eastern seaboard beyond the Appalachians, but to take this to the Mississippi River, to go all the way across from sea to shining sea. This movement on the part of a very romanticizing nation, the United States, moving into areas that at this stage, like Florida, for example, belonged as part of the Spanish Empire. The Louisiana Purchase here, the French controlled a large area, which you can see is the colony of Louisiana. They controlled this for a long time. They lost it in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. Spain took it over. The French are going to get it back in 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte is going to sell here this territory literally for 3 cents of an acre to the President of the United States at that time, Thomas Jefferson. So it's the ultimate, it's a great deal, putting it mildly, because Napoleon Bonaparte has no interest in North America whatsoever. His interest here is in making France the dominant power on the continent of Europe. So this is something, as far as he's concerned, can fall by the wayside. Well, with the onset of the Louisiana Purchase, as the Americans are going to get this, it brings on here more and more this movement of expanding all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Well, when this happens here, and we can see in terms of what the nation looks like in 1800, in the blue areas or blue territories, that represents free areas or free states or free territories. In red, this represents here slave states, the slave states. And I'd like to say that the northern states were more enlightened. They weren't. They weren't, not in any way, shape, or form. But simply here, in terms of slavery as an institution, it didn't fit into what the Northeast and eventually what the Midwest was looking for. What were they looking for? They were looking to follow an example, comparable, the northeastern part of the U.S., comparable to that of Britain. Remember that Industrial Revolution begins in Britain in 1760, and it made Britain the wealthiest nation the world had ever known. The second nation to modernize, to industrialize, was the nation of France. And it made France here in the early 1800s the second wealthiest nation the world had ever known. Both of them had been very wealthy even before the Industrial Revolution, but now they took it to a whole new level. As far as these blue states are concerned here, these one-time colonies now representing the northeast of this new nation, the United States, just 5 million strong in 1800. This is the wave of the future. This is the path forward for our nation. We have a superabundance here of raw materials. The sky literally, I mean, there's just basically no end to this. In terms here of positive force rolling across this nation, especially here as more and more people arrive and more opportunities there are, we could become, in essence, something like a miniature Western Europe, at least in terms of overall success. So the northeastern part wants to here move into what is called Northwest Territory. We saw that, we talked about the French and Indian War some weeks ago. Also into Indiana Territory, which Wisconsin was at one time here in 1800 part of. Pushing here the boundaries, pushing all the way across to the Mississippi River. Relocating here countless scores of Native American tribes who had been pushed from the East Coast beyond the Appalachians. Now they're going to be pushed from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River and beyond as well into the historic western part of the United States. Well, the Northeast by 1820, the northeastern part of the United States is far wealthier overall than the southern part, than the southern region. And for the northeastern here sector, they're looking at industrializing and manufacturing, and it's in its embryonic stage. I wouldn't even call it its infancy. But you have here the construction of railroads, which is also going to revolutionize here transportation. To give an example, in 1840, to take here a stagecoach from Milwaukee to Chicago took 3.5 days. Yeah, it's a long journey. 3.5 days. Roads were in terrible shape. The horses would become absolutely exhausted. You could make it here in about 2.5 days. 2.5 days if you kept changing over horses, get a new group and then continue on. Once you introduce the railroad, though, holy mackerel, it becomes like this revolutionary movement. You can zip all over, literally, this nation across here, the historic Northeast. So in this sense, as you can see in terms of these blue states, you've got the free states here being added. By the same end, as this manifest destiny slowly moves now to the Mississippi, what you also have here is you have the expansion of slave states. And if we look at our chart here in 1789, here at the time shortly after the birth of the nation, what you have here with the Constitution becoming official, you have 8 slave states, 5 free states. By the time we get to 1800, 9 slave states, 8 free states. By the time we get to 1820, the free states here in blue, they're a lot wealthier, and they want to bring in 1820 the state of Maine. They want to bring Maine here formally into the Union. Well, as far as the southern states were concerned, as far as they're concerned, anytime you want to bring in a free state, you have to bring in 2 new slave states. You bring in 3 new free states here, as we're moving westward, you have to bring in 3 new slave states. Because the concern on the part of the southern states is that what's going on here is we're having here the northeastern part of this nation becoming fairly wealthy, very wealthy, in fact. They are modernizing. They have here the vast majority of the railroad tracks, about 90% of them here by 1820, and it's still in its infancy. So it's going to be here something to closely watch, to closely monitor. Why? Simple. Because they are convinced, the southern states are convinced here by 1820 that what the plan is on the part of the northern states is basically to encompass the entire region of North America, or as much as possible, and then watch this institution, this southern way of life, this slavery, formally die on the vine. Well, for life for the American slaves, it was extremely difficult. And remember, this wasn't addressed. And even if it would have been addressed here at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, it would have gone nowhere. We reference the fact of Gouverneur Morris, who wrote the preamble, "We the People," starting here, the Constitution written by this Pennsylvania politician. He was bitterly opposed to slavery. He's a northern delegate, but he also represented far more the exception here of those 55 delegates as opposed to the norm. So you have here this very, very difficult, very brutal way of life. And as far as the Northeast is concerned, this is also an embarrassment. Now, what you do have is you have slavery had been abolished across historic Europe. It's going to be effectively outlawed in Britain in 1833. No more slaves, and slavery had been very, very small in the island nation of Britain to begin with. Effectively outlawed in 1833. In France, remember these 2 nations, it was more of like a love-hate relationship that the Americans had here as this small one-time colony of each. What you have here in France, slavery will be completely abolished in 1848. It became here a sense, if you have slavery, if one group of human beings enslaving another, this represents a tremendous, tremendous evil. It's an embarrassment. It's a disgrace. You claim in the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, that all men are created equal. Well then, what do you consider here black people in this nation? Are they not equal? Are they not citizens? Remember, in terms of how they'd be counted as well. Well, in this situation, you have the abolitionist movement becoming all the more prominent. It becomes here all the more prominent. Harriet Tubman becomes one of the major conductors, as they were known as, on the Underground Railroad. And with the issue here for slaves, and it was estimated that more than 100,000 of them are going to escape over the course of the first half of the 19th century. What you would have, Harriet Tubman, a one-time slave herself, she escapes, and what she would do as a conductor is she would go back into the South. This is ungodly dangerous. And here in different plantations and all sorts of aliases, etc., she would recruit here slaves if they wanted to follow her. She'd only take a few at a time. She would take here, rescue here, approximately 70 slaves. But she would make 17 trips, 17 missions here to the historic South. And what you would do is you would travel here on this Underground Railroad. She's one of many. It was easier for white abolitionists, certainly, to do this. They'd usually portray themselves as preachers. And to rescue here these people from slavery, her rule of thumb was as follows. Once you agree to it and once we take that first step forward, you have to continue. You have no choice. If you refuse, you will be killed. And I will see to it, because you cannot risk here this operation of the 4 or 5 of us. What happens here is it becomes all the more of a prominent thing, becomes all the more of a moral issue for the northern states, especially those who, in fact, formerly were borderlining the historic South. And in this case, you have a daughter of a very prominent Protestant minister here in the United States. His name was Lyman Beecher. Her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe was married. She had 5 children. Her father was strongly opposed to slavery. And what she's living in here in the state of Ohio is she's living in Cincinnati, a border state. And she would witness here as a young woman, young mother, she would witness here slave catchers coming up after the slaves and the brutality and how horrific it was in terms of them being taken from the southern part, from the city of Cincinnati, back across here the Ohio River, back into slave territories. And what she decides to do in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is she sits down after she has put her kids to bed, and she would write here night after night what becomes this blockbuster novel, not just in the United States, not just in the U.S., at least the northern states, but across as well parts of Europe and other parts of the world, what becomes known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what she does in this novel is nothing short of extraordinary. She basically here points out through Uncle Tom. Now, Uncle Tom here is this black gentleman who is sold in slavery along with his wife and children. And it starts off with the injustice of it all and how these families are separated, never to see one another ever again. And Uncle Tom is somebody who's going to take on the burden. He's going to take on the sins of American society on his shoulders. And in essence, it's heart-wrenching, it's horrific, it's awful. Queen Victoria, Queen of England from 1837 to 1901, stressed that it was the most incredible book she had ever read in her entire life. Well, what you have here, the impact, what this is going to do is it's going to draw the North and the South even further apart. They had a movement historically going back to the time of the Constitutional Convention and shortly after of compromise, 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 compromise. We saw that, especially with the small states and the larger states. But in this situation here, what starts happening is as far as the Northeast is concerned, which has a population that is nearly 3 times that of the historic southern states, this whole continuation of the expansion of slavery cannot happen. It cannot happen. And you have, in 1854, born in Ripon, Wisconsin, the Republican Party, little one-room schoolhouse, basically. And with the Republican Party, what made it so radical when it comes into existence in 1854, it's going to sweep to the curb here the Whig Party, which had been the successor to the Federalist Party. What you have here with this Republican Party is they are planning to put in an anti-slave platform here on the presidential campaign forthcoming in 1860. They're going to formally have this here as part of their campaign platform. So in this situation here, as far as the southern states are concerned, this has nothing to do with the northern states. Nothing whatsoever here to do with the northern states. And they also realize that what the North is now up to, as this Republican Party in the 1850s becomes more and more prominent here, just getting off the ground from 1854, what the Republican plan here is to completely seal off no more slave states. Wherever slavery here exists, wherever it exists, it can continue. We're not going to move in, the federal forces aren't going to come rolling in here and abolish it entirely. We're going to cut it off, we're going to isolate it, and eventually it's going to die on the vine. Enough is enough. This is not sustainable. For God's sakes, it's the middle of the 19th century. This is morally wrong, this is an embarrassment. And also in terms of the South, what you need to do is transition, transform, and follow here the example of what has been going on in the Northeast. The centerpiece of American power and prominence as far as Northeastern politicians are concerned. But it's a movement here as well that's moving across into the Midwest, into Michigan territory, what's going to soon be 1848, the state of Wisconsin, the state of Michigan, etc. You see a different outlook, a different pathway across the board through and through. And this is the path forward for the nation. As far as the southern states are concerned, our traditional way of life has nothing to do, and this is exactly what we were worried about back at the Constitutional Convention, or our ancestors were. that you're going to have these larger, more prominent, more wealthier states here telling us what we can and cannot do. We're not interfering with New York. We're not interfering with Pennsylvania, nor should they be interfering with our rights. We represent the true America. We represent here what the Founding Fathers were speaking about back in 1787. Well, compromise here is going to come to pass. It simply is no longer possible. Stephen Douglas, a prominent Democratic senator, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is going to stress here that we've always compromised in this nation. Anytime we had 2 new free states, we had 2 new slave states, we need to continue that. There's no other options. The only other option would be civil war, and that would be entirely and completely unacceptable. And also here in these respective territories, let the citizens there decide if they want to be slave or free. And if it ends up being here a free state and they'd prefer to live in a slave state, then they can move. They can always move. But the citizens here in these territories, this final step towards becoming an actual state, they should be allowed to formally here agree as to what they want or what they don't want. Well, you can see, as we're stretching across the nation, now we're in 1860, 1861, and what had been a slave state advantage going back to 1789, now by 1861, you have 19 free states, 15 slave states. And as far as this new political party is concerned, the Republican Party, there will be no further expansion of slavery. Not talking that the institution itself needs to be abolished, but stressing here that it cannot go any further. Well, coming forth here from the Republican Party in the late 1850s would be Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln, the image here of him, he has 1 year of formal schooling, and with Lincoln, he is viewed by presidential historians overwhelmingly as the greatest president the U.S. ever had. I would agree 100%. Lincoln is in a league all his own. And it's not just in terms of his leadership at this critical time in U.S. history. It is also the fact of what an exceptional human being he is. Now, as human beings, we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, no doubt about that. That's what it means to be human. Well, here for Lincoln is a case of, as series in the past I talked about in World War II, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, mastermind Isoroku Yamamoto, December 7th, 1941. Got a master's degree here in literature from Harvard University in 1921. He was fluent in English. He hitchhiked his way all the way across the United States on his way back to Japan in 1924, and he was amazed at the vast industrial complex of this nation. Though he's the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor in World War II, Isoroku Yamamoto is completely and utterly opposed to it. He knows it's going to work, but he knows long-term Japan doesn't have a chance in war against the U.S. But an interesting side note is that Yamamoto had his own historical hero, and his own historical hero here was Abraham Lincoln. And Carl Sandburg's biography of Lincoln was required reading for his Imperial War Staff. Why? Simple. Because as far as Yamamoto was concerned, not only was Abraham Lincoln a superb leader, but far more important than that, he was an exceptional human being. An exceptional human being. I would agree with Yamamoto on both points. And what you have is an individual whose private life, oh dear God. I mean, all of us experience tragedy. Life is difficult here, this journey of life. No doubt about that whatsoever. Lincoln's, oh dear Lord. It's like everything you think could go wrong is going to go wrong and then some. There are more than 10,000 biographies written on Abraham Lincoln. And here I'd strongly recommend, well, I'm totally biased because I adore her, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals. It's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I was talking in terms of biographies, and Winston Churchill, who had hundreds written by him at the time they got to the 1950s. He asked about a new one that was coming forth. He said, well, I think that area has been plowed up and plowed over enough, quite frankly. Howard Stern's a bit of a shock jock, as he's known as in New York City. When he came out with his first book, it was a lighthearted look in terms of American society, etc. He had other books by Howard Stern, which was all just a bunch of BS. You know, he was joking around. And one of them was Winston Churchill, the teenage years. Well, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln here is this wood splitter, this frontiersman. The frontier was Illinois and the land of cheese, though it wasn't known as the land of cheese at that time, Wisconsin. But this is the area here, 1850s. It's settled, but it's kind of like the wild, wild west. Because once you got west of the Mississippi, that was pretty much like planet Mars, at least at this stage, unless you were in California. Well, here for Lincoln, what you have is he's this long shot. And he lost so many elections, dear God. There's a classic example in life. It's not important if you get knocked on your behind. What's important is that you get back up. And he loved politics. And he loved people. And he felt firmly he could make a difference in a very, very positive way. Well, Matthew Brady is going to take this photograph of him in his New York City studio here in 1864 to make him look as a more legitimate statesman instead of this woodcutter. He had 1 year of formal education. You can see there's pillars in the background. It's a backdrop there. It's not actual pillars. He's putting his hand here on books, making him look as though he's a very learned man, etc. And Brady's pulling up his collar before he takes his picture. And Lincoln always said his neck was like an ostrich, basically. And in this case here, he's like, oh, my neck's too long, and Brady didn't want to say that, but that's exactly it. Classic example of self-deprecating sense of humor in the Lincoln-Douglas debates in northern Illinois. One time here, people love this. He's a superb debater, superb public speaker, Lincoln. And somebody from the back yelled at him, "You're two-faced," to Abraham Lincoln when he was up doing his spiel on stage with Stephen Douglas at his side, his great opponent. To which Lincoln, when he was told he was two-faced, he said, "Do you think if I had another face, this is the face I'd be wearing?" Well, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln is going to be elected. He'll be elected here President of the United States. He wasn't even in the top 5 Republican candidates, but he ended up being here, in essence, this alternative candidate. The Republican convention in 1860 would be held in Chicago, where he'd be viewed, of course, being from Springfield for the better part of his life, although he's born in Kentucky, lived part of it as well in Indiana. He is going to be viewed by many Chicago Republicans here and Republicans throughout the state as more of this local boy who made good. He's an alternative candidate, and he's going to be nominated. And Lincoln here, the warnings are going to be sent forth because of this new political party. You have here a political party that has this anti-slavery platform. And the southern states had already warned, that in essence, if you have any of the Republicans here, whoever it is, Lincoln or whoever, whatever the situation may be, if they emerge victorious in the election of 1860, we're done. We're seceding. Enough's enough. Well, the Democratic Party here, which was super prominent across the South, and the Democratic Party as well across the North, they have a rift. And they split themselves here in two. So it's obvious whoever comes out victorious of the Republican National Convention in Chicago in the summer of 1860, that person is going to become the next president of the United States, and indeed, it is Lincoln. It is Lincoln. Now, from the standpoint of Lincoln, when he becomes a new president, one of the things that's really cool about him is that all these rivals, people like Seward, for example, prominent New York politician, senator, they're all very, very learned, very super bright, super accomplished in Washington, D.C. Lincoln served 1 year, I should say 1 term of 2 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois. But what he does is, despite all of the attacks that he had took from these people of being so underqualified, it was pathetic, he knows that they also know a good deal more than he does. So he brings them on his cabinet at this critical time. Bates, Seward, the list was endless. His issue here is how to preserve the Union. How to preserve the Union. He's overly optimistic. There's no doubt about that. No doubt whatsoever. He doesn't think that secession, at least not initially, that secession is actually going to take place. But the South had warned. The South had warned is really, you have, in essence, 2 very distinct nations at this time. You have here the southern states, you have the northern states. They're following 2 very different pathways. What all this is going to mean wasn't entirely clear, but there could be no more compromise. And the South was convinced that not only is slavery going to now be limited, which would be the case, that eventually here the federal government is going to force its abolition 100%. Well, as to if that was actually going to happen, who knows? But as far as the northern states and as far as this new political party was concerned, this institution was not sustainable. The British have abolished it, the French have abolished it, it is abolished across all of Europe. It's time for the United States, it's 1860, to follow suit. Well, with this movement of secession, South Carolina on December 20th, 1860, even before Lincoln is inaugurated, is going to announce it is withdrawing from the Union. So too is the case with Mississippi and Florida shortly after, followed by Alabama and Georgia. Louisiana and Texas would secede as well on the same day, February 1st, 1861. The inauguration, now presidents are inaugurated in January. That didn't begin until Franklin Roosevelt in the following the 1944 election. The time it was always here in early March. So by the time Lincoln becomes president of the United States, by the time he becomes president of the United States, the time of his inauguration on March 4th, 1861, you have a good many southern states, 8 of them have already left. And what he is doing is very wise. He's following a conciliatory approach here with the South, that he's not even going to talk about secession. He's going to talk about here issues, challenges that we're facing as a nation. And this, of course, is an act of treason because in the Constitution, states cannot simply withdraw from this nation. Well, how to deal with it, especially as more and more are going, such is the case. And you have here, across the northern states, you have a very strong pro-Lincoln approach, very, very supportive here of this new president. As far as the southern states are concerned, this person is the absolute worst of all in American history. This abomination, this disgrace, this embarrassment, this gorilla, they would oftentimes refer to him as well. From Lincoln's standpoint, one thing was certain. He is not going to fire the first shot. He is not going to fire the first shot. If the South, which is now calling itself the Confederate States of America, which he's never once going to ever refer to the South as a confederacy, he'll call them here the rebels, perhaps, but never give them any sort of legitimacy whatsoever. What he is going to do here is he's going to wait. If the South wants war, they have to fire the first shot. Well, in April of 1861, off the coast of South Carolina, Confederate forces are going to attack Fort Sumter. April of 1861. And the American Civil War here is going to formally begin, the 12th of April, the exact date. Well, as you can see looking at this, this is a constitutional crisis to the high heavens, because you have here the Union states all etched out here formally in red on our overview here. You have, as well as these are the states in blue across the South that seceded before Fort Sumter was attacked. In gray, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, the largest of all the southern states, a fairly wealthy state too, no doubt about that. They're all going to secede after here the fall of Fort Sumter. So for Lincoln, it's out on being more of a case of damage control. As you can see in this teal color, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, these states here are technically slave states, but they're not going to secede. And he doesn't want them to secede either. He doesn't want them here to formally secede. The goal, the hope, the focus, the objective for Lincoln, this isn't a moral crusade regarding slavery as far as he is concerned. The goal is to preserve. It is to preserve here the Union, to preserve the Union at all costs. And in this sense, following the fall of Fort Sumter in 1861, Jefferson Davis is going to be introduced as the new president of the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States of America are going to write their own constitution, which is it's an exact replica of the United States Constitution from 1787, with the exception here of one add-on, that slavery will last here in this Confederate States of America forevermore, for eternity. The one thing that would be added. Well, in this case here, Fort Sumter will fall with tremendous ease. It simply was ill prepared for any sort of long siege. And here, if you're going into the Civil War, and what this means for the nation, what you have here on paper is that the North has huge advantages. It has some monumental advantages here. First of all, it has a population nearly triple that of the South. Second of all, in terms of this industrialization or the industrial revolution going on, manufacturing, the northern states control literally 80% of it. The South has only 20%. Railroad tracks. Railroad tracks are also huge in terms of moving troops wherever and however you want them. 90% of the railroad tracks are across the northern states. So you have here a population that is massive by comparison, and by step, in terms of modern industrialized states here in the 19th century and the 20th century, squaring off against underdeveloped entities, which quite frankly the South is, huge advantage to the modern industrialized power. By the same end, though, it's going to be difficult. It is also going to be very, very difficult. And it's going to be difficult because what you have for the northern forces and for Abraham Lincoln is you have to not only invade the South, and defeat here these Confederate forces, you also here have to militarily occupy the entire area. And the entire area of the South is way larger than all of Western Europe. So this is not an easy task, not by any stretch of the imagination. What he is going to do, Lincoln, starting now in 1861, first and foremost, following a very similar British example. He's going to take the U.S. Navy. The South has no Navy. He's going to take the American Navy, and he is going to here blockade the entire coastline of the South. You're not going to let anything in. You're not going to let anything out. The primary export here from the South to Europe was cotton, king cotton. And in this sense here, what the southern states were hoping for and expecting is that the British and or French are going to intervene. They are going to intervene just like France intervened back when the British set up that blockade at the time of the American Revolutionary War and forced here the British to lift that blockade. That the British and the French, who are so dependent here on southern cotton, they will have no choice but to get themselves involved. And they will force Lincoln and these Yankees to lift this blockade once and for all. Otherwise, what it's going to mean is a slow, gradual strangulation of the historic South. So for the southern states, they're counting here on the British and the French. The British and the French find the whole thing amusing, to be honest with you, in 1861, because the Americans always had this holier-than-thou attitude of superiority here at their so-called experiment, and now it's crumbling right before their very eyes. But the British and the French also are going to steer clear. Jumel cotton they will receive from Egypt. It's not as the same high quality of southern cotton in the United States, but still it would hold matters over. So the blockade of the South here, the hope for Lincoln is he'll be able to hold on to it indefinitely. There's going to be two major theaters as well. The Eastern Theater, which is far more important here for the Union forces, as well as the Western Theater. For the Southern forces, eventually here under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, what you have here is what they're focused on is simply repelling, pushing back, taking on here the superior numbers of the Union Army and holding on, holding out at all costs, on the hope here that eventually the northern states will realize this is no longer worth it. It simply is a waste of our time. And what they'll end up doing instead, is formally withdrawing. And we will have this new state, what the Founding Fathers envisioned back in 1787 in Philadelphia, the true United States of America, but called the Confederate States of America. And you'll have, in essence, this two-state solution. This is what the goal, the hope, the focus, the objective was of the southern states. Their task, despite the fact being badly outnumbered in terms of overall financial resources, the Northeast and the Midwest has a great deal more than what the southern slave states have, but to hold on and hold out at all costs and eventually preserve their independence. This is the big constitutional crisis. Huge, huge crisis for this nation. And from the standpoint here of the Northerners, they looked upon the Southerners as these not just rebels, but these treasonous thugs, these criminals who were a disgrace, an embarrassment here to the nation. But the issue here and the rallying point for your average Northerner was not the abolition of slavery. That is going to be something that Lincoln's going to add here a bit later in the Civil War with his Emancipation Proclamation. The focal point is the preservation of this Union. And the belief firmly on the part of the North is that this nation will be far better off going on into the indefinite future, staying together as one and moving on, as opposed to having here two distinct states. As far as the southern states were concerned, they're smaller in number in terms of population and soldiers. They can field very, very small forces, but effective forces. But they also have a great deal of confidence that they can more than hold their own, that they're better soldiers, they're better marksmen, they're better riding horseback, et cetera, et cetera. This war is eventually going to take the lives of 680,000 people, making it the single most destructive event in all of U.S. history. In all of World War II, the United States lost 410,000 lives. The American Civil War, with a population at this time in the U.S. of just 23 million, the American Civil War here is going to crank things up to a whole new level in terms of an absolutely horrific event. A horrific event that is going to go on for years and is going to lead, in essence, to 3 major amendments to the U.S. Constitution, with the hope that the vision of this experiment, perhaps in a better fashion, would finally now come to its fruition. And the course of this briefly, as well as these constitutional amendments here, that will then prove to blow the door wide open in this immigrant nation of the United States for newcomers to begin flocking in greater and greater numbers, we will see in our presentation next time. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Any questions at all before we formally break up? If so, swing on up. I'll hang around. Otherwise, thanks so much for being here. Have a great week, and we'll see you again soon for part 5.